You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 325 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about the massive $85 billion budget the Trump administration is looking for U.S. intelligence agencies in 2020. General Dunford said that the Wall Street Journal report claiming the U.S. is going to keep 1,000 troops in Syria is factually incorrect. And I want to break down Mike Pompeo's response to Congress looking to push the U.S. out of the Yemen War. Please take the time to share this show or recommend it to a friend. The best place to find it online is at the Libertarian Institute, where my show and the daily news roundup are featured on the homepage. Most of my work also ends up getting published by the LP Mises Caucus, so you can find it on their website. The show should be on all the podcatchers, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, BitChute. So please take the time to subscribe to the show somewhere. That way you don't miss an episode. And then if you really want to support the show, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I do put out some bonus content that you can get access to. All right, so it looks like in the fiscal year 2020, the Trump administration will be looking for over $85 billion to spend on the intelligence agencies. Now, this includes military intelligence. About $25 billion is their chunk of this, and then it spreads out to the other dozen or so intelligence agencies in the United States, CIA, NSA, etc. Now, reasons why this is so important is if we look at world defense spending, the U.S. is way out in the front, and we're talking about $750 billion next year, not including the VA, the intelligence budgets, any kind of slush fund backdoor activity that's going on, stuff that's way too classified to be in any kind of budget anywhere, and then interest on the debt from the previous wars. But then after the United States, you have China and the 200s of billions. And after that, Saudi Arabia and Russia, both under, I believe, $70 billion is the estimate for 2019. So the U.S. budget in 2020, our intelligence budget, is going to be the, ranked third highest on the defense spending charts. It's just one small aspect of the U.S. defense regime change military budget. Now, the best analysis, I think, is going to be from Dan McAdams and Ron Paul at the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Now, I'll link to the episode in the show notes page. But they break down and explain, the big thing here is that this is an offensive capability. Look at the list of regime change operations that the U.S. has carried out over the years. Iran, we are able to overthrow a massive country. I mean, we're talking about Persia here. And we are able to use a CIA coup in 1953 to overthrow that government. Certainly a lot of meddling in Central and South America. And the CIA conducts a massive drone war overseas that we know little to nothing about. I mean, there may be CIA drone strikes going on right now in Somalia, but nobody actually has any evidence, or the government really doesn't admit to if that's happening at all. Another big risk here is just that so much of this money actually ends up oppressing Americans, putting propaganda in the faces of Americans, rather than actually going to catch terrorists. I think if people looked at this budget, they would be like, oh, this is the catch terrorist money. This is what we use to go out and, take out the very worst of the bad guys to make sure Americans are safe. When in reality, and we find out what this money is actually being spent on, it turns out that it's on programs that spy on all Americans. Now, maybe you're thinking, Kyle, this is a little preemptive. This is only a proposed budget. Congress is going to get this thing under control and work it out. And, so many times that isn't what happens. And in fact, we've had years where the Pentagon and the administration, whether it's Trump or Obama, proposes a defense budget, and then the Congress takes it a step further and, forces upon them things that they're not even asking for in their budget. So, from all my experience observing American politics, budgets never go anywhere but up. And so if, there's any revisions to this, it'll probably end up, meaning more money, not less money in this intelligence budget. And of course, I usually talk about the, spending on defense and everything in terms of taking money out of our pockets. And that's certainly happening. And, even if it's through inflation, that's a hidden tax as well. But so much of this money ends up being debt that we're borrowing and that we have to pay interest on later. And so a lot of the people that are, voting on or supporting these kind of budgets won't even be the ones that are paying for it ever. So, that's really disappointing and a real flaw with, the way America does our budgeting and all kinds of practices like that. All right, this is a story that I've talked a little bit about, but I finally saw it in print, and it's just not me talking. But basically, Forbes, I'll link to it in the show notes page, breaks down how the U.S. sanctions, especially on Venezuela and Iran, are really putting us in a bind when it comes to oil prices. So Saudi Arabia, OPEC, and Russia have all made at least verbal agreements that they're going to cut their oil production. However, no one has really gone through with it, but there's always the potential that they actually go through with these production cuts. And on top of that, the U.S. is looking to cut and reduce the amount of oil that Venezuela and Iran are putting on the market. Gas prices are, kind of slowly going up. Oil prices, I think, have crept from $60 to $70 a barrel. And so there's a worry here that, at least from my perspective, the United States is going to see that our foreign policy is causing gas prices in the United States to go up. Come election time, I do think this is, something of importance. And so my guess is that most Americans aren't going to go, oh, gas prices are high because of our disastrous foreign policy. Democrats will blame Trump for letting the oil companies price gouge us, and Republicans will blame the environmentalists on the left, and nobody's even going to pay any mind to the fact that, it's really the U.S. that's suppressing all of these, oil exports and then seeing gas prices go up. Now, a couple other things I took from this article. One is that, they really do a good job of going through and breaking down like what each individual country's oil production capabilities are, what they're currently producing. They're able to identify, I think Azerbaijan is going through a infrastructure update over the next couple of months. So they're going to take 2,000 barrels per oil a day off the market just because they have to update their pipelines or whatever mining equipment that they use, or, oil well digging equipment. And then the other is the United States is really in a position now where we have to hope that Saudi Arabia doesn't go through with these OPEC cuts, because that's going to jack up oil prices at a time where I think Trump would want lower oil prices. And so, when we look at why possibly would the United States continue to support the war in Yemen, why wouldn't we take any action against the Saudis over Jamal Khashoggi and, the brutal way they murdered him in the Turkish consulate? And, well, maybe it's because of oil, not that we're trying to steal oil, just because we need Saudi Arabia to put as much oil on the market as they can. That way we could sanction and limit oil exports from Venezuela and Iran. Overall, I can't imagine that it's worth it to the rest of us Americans. I mean, we have an Iran nuclear agreement where their nuclear program is safeguarded and locked down. We don't have anything to worry about with them getting nukes. And so we could let them export more oil. And then maybe we could, change our relationship up with Saudi Arabia a little bit, be a little bit, less friendly there, not help them out so much in Yemen. And there's no hostilities possible from, there's not even the pretext that Venezuelans are going to hop on a ship and sail to the United States. They're not, developing missiles to launch at the United States. The fact that they could possibly be an offensive threat to the United States has never really even been discussed. It's not like anybody in the mainstream media is sitting there going, boy, I really know that we need to overthrow the Maduro government because they might launch a war against the United States any day now. I mean, that's just not even talked about. As incredible as that sounds, that some people are talking about military intervention, and there's not even the little bit of, we have to find some way to justify this from the position of the safety of Americans. So we could, just have good relations with Venezuela and Iran and let them export oil. So I read this story from Canada saying that they're going to keep their 200 trainers in Ukraine for now. These are military personnel deployed to Ukraine, saying they're training the Ukrainian army. Of course, the U.S. has sold the Ukrainian army weapons, even though there's neo-Nazi factions embedded within the Ukrainian army. And, these are legit neo-Nazis. It's not some guy who supports Trump. These are guys that, have the SS's and look, kind of to Hitler and Stefan Bandera for their ideology. So these are bad dudes. And yet, they have all this Western support because, evil Russia is looking to meddle in Ukraine. Well, Russia's Canada. And so Russia's very concerned about what happens in Ukraine, and that doesn't justify all their actions, and whether they should seize the Crimean Peninsula or not is a topic that's worthy of debate. However, I just wanted to, take this example to remind us that we continue to not ally with the good guys. There's always this assumption that if the United States and our Western allies are on the side of somebody, it's definitely the good guys. We're opposed to the Nazis and the commies and all the terrible ones. But that's not what's going on here. I also thought it was a good time to bring up Ukraine could, I think, cycle back into the news again soon, as the country should be undergoing elections here soon around Ukraine joining NATO or the EU, which would cause quite a bit of conflict with Russia. Russia has already said that this is a red line for them, that they would absolutely not let NATO absorb Ukraine. And then the Minsk II ceasefire kind of treaty that's roughly holding in place between the, opposing sides in the Ukrainian civil war, which is pretty much the Ukrainian state versus the Donbass region, which is pro-Russian separatist in the very east of Ukraine. And, fighting there could break out again if, these elections don't go the right way or there's instability. And, elections bring up a lot more emotion, I think. And it's big time for everybody's involved in politics and easily get together to rally. And so keep an eye on Ukraine. The U.S. flew some more B-52 bombers over islands close to Chinese territorial waters in the South China Sea. So far these incidents have pretty much occurred without any kind of accidents or anything like that. Although there was, I believe, a U.S. spy plane that collided with some kind of Chinese plane back under the Bush administration, and a near miss between a couple of ships flying around islands there in the South China Sea. And a few incidents of the 7th Fleet being in disarray and running aground or running into merchant ships. But we haven't had anything that led to, really greater tensions with China or any kind of shooting incidents with China, which is good. But the more we carry out these missions, and they're happening, more frequently under Obama and now more frequently under Trump, I think it gets increasingly more dangerous. All right, so the very end of last show, I forgot to talk about this story of the Wall Street Journal about Syria keeping 1,000 forces there. And I guess I shouldn't have, because a couple days later, Joseph Dunford, who is the Joint Chiefs of Staff commander, said that report isn't factually correct, I believe, or factually incorrect is the phrase he used. Now, he didn't say that we're only keeping 400 troops in Syria, which makes me think that, maybe there was a report that up to 1,000 could stay, and he thinks it's going to be, closer to 500 or something. But I think this maybe is a little bit of better news, because, while I was saying we're talking about 1,000 troops, and I think we're talking about a force that's going to look to occupy at least a large chunk of eastern Syria, where if we're only talking about 200 or 400, maybe we just have a few troops here and there at Al-Tanaf, and then somewhere up in kind of the heavy Kurdistan regions. Now, as far as I could tell, the Syrian Kurds are saying that they defeat the last little pocket of the Islamic State there. But I haven't seen this, great mission accomplished banner or anything like that from the U.S. or even from the Syrian Kurds. Just a couple of tweets out about them finally defeating the last pocket of ISIS there. So this is going to be an interesting kind of thing for the Trump administration to navigate, because I think Donald Trump is going to want to take a lot of very loud and proud credit for defeating ISIS. But at the same time, we're going to keep troops in Syria, and so if ISIS is defeated, how are we keeping troops in Syria? Now, there's always the Iran excuse, Iran. That's why we have to stay everywhere in the world. However, I think, there's a pretty good argument to make that there's no congressional authorization from that whatsoever. And so they also, I think, are going to have to keep up this kind of line that, ISIS has now turned into an insurgency, and so while the physical caliphate has been defeated, we now have to defeat the ideology, which is completely insane. It is never going to work, and something I talked about time and time again on the show. The reason why, there's more Al-Qaeda now than there was on 9/11 is because we've radicalized more people with all of our bombs and wars and instability in the Middle East. That's led to more people accepting that ideology, and you can't kill that ideology with bombs. It's just not going to happen. There was a story that came out, an announcement by Turkey, I believe, that they were conducting joint operations with Iran along the Iranian-Turkish border against the Syrian or the Turkish Kurds and their militia, the PKK. Iran came out pretty quickly and denied this. So, kind of an interesting thing unfolding here. I do think one of the consequences of the Syrian civil wars is actually increased relations between Iran and Turkey, as they've largely been in the negotiations to figure out ways to wrap up this war. And even though they're in ways on opposing sides of this war, they also have common enemies in not only the Syrian Kurds who are causing Assad problems, but also there's Kurds in Iran who at times have sought independence. In a northern district in Afghanistan along the border with Turkmenistan, the Taliban have been making major gains in the past week, capturing over 150 Afghani soldiers in one incident. They actually, I guess it was like a border crossing area. They attacked and pushed the Afghani soldiers into Turkmenistan, who then turned those soldiers over to the Taliban. And so I guess first off, I thought was an interesting note that I guess the Taliban have enough of a relationship, or the Turkmenistan government is okay enough with the Taliban that they're willing to kind of just feed these Afghan soldiers to them. But also that, this isn't the Afghan Southwest Helmand Kandahar area. This is northern Afghanistan. There's certainly Taliban and Pashtun strongholds up there. But this is territory being gained along the border with another nation, and, further big losses by the Afghan government. I think in the past week in this one district alone, over 200 Afghan soldiers captured or killed. All right, last up on today's show, Pompeo's statement on Yemen. So, it's incredibly stupid. Basically, he just says that we can't allow the Iranian influence to exist in Iran, and that Iran has now spread from Iran to Syria to Iraq to Lebanon and is a threat towards Israel. And then he says on down to Yemen, like there isn't Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all huge, Israel, Jewish state, but Saudi Arabia and Jordan, Sunni states in between these two countries. It was just a very strange claim, and I think anybody who listens to the show knows the first thing about the Middle East definitely understands that Iran hasn't been a malign actor through, 2001 on, and just through their actions gained all this territory. They've mostly just exploited U.S. mistakes. The U.S. made the mistake of overthrowing Saddam and instituting democracy in Iraq. And at that point, it was obviously going to be a more Iran-aligned government because the majority population in Iraq is Shiites. In Syria, the U.S. attempted to overthrow the Syrian government with a bunch of crazy jihadists, and the Iranians were longtime allies of the Assad family and the Syrian government, and came to the aid of their ally and have now, much larger presence in Syria than they ever did, more influence over the Syrian government than they ever did before because of the U.S. action. And then I guess when you look at Lebanon, it's a little bit more Israeli, as, they invaded and occupied southern Lebanon, and this, resulted in the Hezbollah force that is now at least able to pair them if the Israelis try to invade southern Lebanon. In the past on the show, I've really broken down how the Houthis, the rebel group in Yemen, are not the same kind of Shiites that, you have in Iran. So there's not necessarily that religious link that everybody who, reads one Reuters story or one CNN story is led to believe. That's as surface level as they always make it. Well, Shiites here. Oh, they must be Iranian influence. The missiles, have been broken down and debunked several times. These are not Iranian missiles. The Yemenis have developed, missiles and drone programs, but that's because they've been at war with Saudi Arabia for the past few years. That's not to say that Iran isn't probably happy with the situation in Yemen, as far as, Saudi Arabia is sinking a lot of their military effort and a lot of their money into a country, into a quagmire that's pointed in the opposite direction of Iran. And, wasn't like an Iranian stronghold beforehand. So what do they have to lose in Yemen? And I'm sure if there's any influence that Iran has over Yemen, it's only increasing as Saudi Arabia brutalizes them. Pompeo also talks about the shipping lanes. Now, if you look at a map of Yemen, there are some, pretty close quarters. When you look at the small strip of water between Yemen and Djibouti, and then that's a more narrow area of the Red Sea off the Yemeni coast there. And a whole lot of business moves in and through that area. And so you would want to keep that area stable and, not have a bunch of rockets being launched at ships. But Yemen, the Houthis have only launched missiles at ships a few times. I don't think there's any real threat that they would pose to, passing by ships. And if so, that, problem could be addressed at the time. The U.S. carried out a few airstrikes the last time the Houthis did it, and we haven't seen another strike from the Houthis. Also, I'm not sure how accurate their missiles are. They certainly could fire missiles, and they, could hit land if they fire them at land, and they could hit sea if they fire them at sea. But I don't, the last time they fired at a U.S. ship, I think it was like 6 nautical miles away from the ship the missile actually landed. So the threats from Pompeo are exaggerated, But it's because America is wed to this Saudi policy of this war in Yemen. I guess Donald Trump is sold on it or doesn't care about it enough to let it just go on. I don't think Pompeo's arguments are good or even good enough, but we would have to sway like 7 senators and dozens of representatives in order to get the 2/3 we need in both houses to override Trump's veto on this Yemen War Powers bill. So not exactly holding my breath that that's going to be the way the U.S. withdraws from the war in Yemen. But I did want to take the time to kind of address how the Trump administration has so far responded to this bill now passing the House and Senate. All right, foreign policy focus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Subscribe to the show somewhere. Find me on Facebook at the Libertarian Union and on Twitter at KYAAALE.